The storm that night was the kind that felt like the sky was angry, hurling down sheets of rain and cracking thunder loud enough to rattle windows. In a small town forgotten by most, the old-timers at Murphy's bar had gathered as they always did, drinking to pass the time and sharing tales that blurred the line between truth and fiction. One story, however, always stood out: the legend of the ghost train. It was said that on nights like this, when the sky opened up and the wind howled through the streets, the ghost train would appear. No one could say exactly when it had first been seen, but everyone knew someone who had heard the distant whistle echoing through the hills. They said the train never stopped, its rusted wheels screeching as it hurtled down the tracks, a relic from another time. But the most chilling part of the story wasn't the train itself, it was the passengers. They say anyone who gets on that train, old Pete said, his voice low, never comes back. They're taken. Souls, trapped forever, riding that cursed thing until the end of time. The bar fell silent as the words hung in the air, everyone casting glances at the windows, watching the rain streak down the glass. No one wanted to admit they believed it, but the fear was there, palpable. Daniel, a young journalist new to the town, had heard his share of ghost stories, but this one stuck with him. There was something in the way the old men spoke, the way their eyes darted to the shadows as if the train could appear at any moment. Intrigued, he asked for more details, but they were reluctant to say much more. "Best leave it alone, kid," one of them muttered. "That train's taken enough people." But Daniel wasn't one to leave things alone. That night, as the storm raged on, he made a decision. He would find this train. He would see for himself if the legend was true. Armed with his camera and notebook, he left the bar, the cold wind biting at his skin as he headed toward the abandoned train station at the edge of town. The old station loomed ahead, half hidden by the heavy rain. It was a relic of a time long gone, its roof sagging and windows boarded up. Weeds had overtaken the tracks, and rusted signs creaked with every gust of wind. Daniel hesitated for a moment, the weight of the stories he had heard creeping into his mind. But he shook it off. Ghost trains weren't real. This was just a tale, exaggerated over the years. He was here to prove that. He walked closer, his boots sinking into the mud, the rain soaking through his jacket. The wind howled through the broken windows, making the whole place seem alive, like it was breathing. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't scared. Not really. He was a journalist, here to uncover the truth behind a local legend, and nothing more. Still, as he stood on the platform, staring into the darkness beyond, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Then, he heard it. At first, it was faint, just a distant whistle carried by the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. There hadn't been a train on these tracks in decades. He strained his eyes against the rain, peering down the line, and there, in the distance, a light appeared. His heart pounded in his chest. It wasn't just the sound of a train. It was a train. The massive iron beast materialized out of the storm like something from a nightmare. Its headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the tracks as it thundered toward the station. The wheels screeched, sending sparks flying, but the train didn't slow down. It roared past the platform, a blur of rusted metal and shattered windows, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The doors creaked open, the sound echoing through the empty night. Daniel stood frozen, the rain pouring down his face. Every instinct told him to run, to get as far away from this cursed thing as possible, but something held him there. The open door beckoned, like a dark invitation. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or something else entirely that pushed him forward, but before he knew it, he was stepping toward the train. The air grew colder as he approached, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very soul. He could see his breath now, little clouds of mist hanging in the air as he reached out and gripped the rusted handrail. It was wet and slick, and for a moment, he hesitated. This felt wrong, so wrong. But the door was right in front of him, gaping like the mouth of some giant, waiting to swallow him whole. Against his better judgment, Daniel stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the world outside seemed to vanish. The sound of the storm, the rain, even the wind, all of it was gone. Inside the train, there was only silence, heavy and oppressive. The air smelled of dust and decay, like something that had been sealed away for years. The walls were covered in a thick layer of grime, and the windows were fogged over, making it impossible to see outside. The train car was empty, or so it seemed at first. Rows of seats stretched out before him, each one draped in tattered fabric, worn down by time. Daniel moved forward slowly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. But as he passed each row, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. There was someone there, watching him. He turned a corner, and that's when he saw them. Passengers. Dozens of them. Their bodies were still, slumped in their seats, their faces hidden in shadow. At first glance, they looked like mannequins, lifeless and posed. But as Daniel drew closer, he realized with horror that they weren't mannequins. They were people. Their skin was pale and waxy, their eyes wide open but glazed over, staring into nothingness. He reached out, almost without thinking, and touched one of them. The body was cold. Ice cold. A low, guttural moan echoed from somewhere deeper in the train. Daniel's heart jumped into his throat, and he pulled his hand back, stumbling away from the lifeless passenger. He turned, ready to bolt back to the door, but when he looked behind him, the door was gone. The train had come alive, sealing him in. There was no escape now. Daniel's pulse quickened as the reality of his situation sunk in. The door he had entered through was no longer there. He was trapped. The silence inside the train was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the metal as the train shifted on its tracks. His breath came in shallow bursts, fogging the air in front of him. He had no idea what to do next, but staying put wasn't an option. He needed to find a way out. Slowly, he moved further down the aisle, glancing at the lifeless passengers as he passed. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, mouths slightly open as if they had been screaming when death took them. But there was something worse, something Daniel hadn't noticed before. Each passenger had a small piece of paper clutched tightly in their hand. Tickets. He stopped and looked closer, horrified to see that every ticket had a name printed on it. Names of the dead. His mind raced. This wasn't just a haunted train, it was a tomb, collecting the souls of those who had boarded. But why? What was its purpose? And more importantly, how had he been chosen? As he moved deeper into the train, the air grew colder, and the lights above flickered ominously. The further he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the train itself was trying to suffocate him with dread. Suddenly, he heard a sound, a shuffling from the back of the car. He stopped in his tracks, his heart thundering in his chest. The sound grew louder, like something dragging itself along the floor. He turned his head slowly, not wanting to see what was coming, but knowing he had no choice. In the dim light, a figure emerged from the shadows, crawling on hands and knees down the aisle. It was a passenger, or at least what was left of one. Its clothes were tattered, and its skin hung loosely from its bones, gray and decayed. But the most disturbing part was its face. Half of it was missing, revealing the skeletal structure beneath. It dragged itself forward, inch by inch, its sunken eyes fixed on Daniel with a hunger that chilled him to the core. Panic surged through him, and he bolted down the aisle, his footsteps pounding against the floor as he raced toward the next car. He didn't look back, couldn't afford to. The train groaned as he flung open the door to the next compartment and stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind him. He pressed his back against it, trying to catch his breath, but the eerie silence was replaced by something far worse. Whispers. The entire car was filled with them, soft, hissing voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Daniel's skin crawled as he scanned the rows of seats, but this car was different. There were no passengers, just an empty space filled with the faint echo of disembodied voices. He strained to make out the words, but they were too quiet, too distorted. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He turned his head just in time to see one of the windows fog up, as though something was breathing on the other side. A handprint appeared, pressed against the glass, followed by another. And another. Daniel backed away, dread settling deep in his gut. Whatever was outside the train was trying to get in. Before he could react, the lights flickered again, and with a deafening screech, the entire car plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the unseen forces were drawing closer. Daniel's breath hitched as he felt something cold brush against his arm. He flinched, his heart racing. But when the lights flickered back on, there was nothing there. His hands trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket, desperate for a way to document this nightmare. But the screen was black. Dead. Of course, he thought bitterly. No signal. No way to reach the outside world. The train had cut him off completely. He was alone in this hell, surrounded by the restless dead and something far more sinister. Determined not to lose his sanity, Daniel made his way toward the front of the train, hoping to find the conductor, or at least some clue about what was happening. But as he passed through the next set of doors, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. There, lying in the aisle, was a body. It wasn't like the others, though. This one was fresh. Daniel froze, staring down at the body lying in the aisle. The corpse was different from the others. Its skin still held some color, and there was no sign of decay. The man had died recently, maybe even within the last few hours. His clothes were soaked with rainwater, and his hands still gripped a camera. Daniel's stomach twisted with dread. Whoever this was, they had been like him, someone who came to investigate the legend. And now, they were dead. As he crouched down to inspect the body, a deep sense of unease settled over him. He picked up the camera, hoping for some answers. Maybe this person had captured something, anything, that could explain what was going on. His hands shook as he powered it on, half expecting it to be dead like his phone. But to his surprise, the screen flickered to life. The last video file was time-stamped earlier that night, just before the storm had reached its peak. Daniel hit play, and the small screen illuminated his face in the dim light. The video showed the man boarding the train, much like Daniel had. There was nervous laughter, some commentary about the haunted train being just an urban myth. But as the recording continued, the man's tone changed. His voice trembled, his words became frantic. The camera shook violently as he filmed the empty seats, the same lifeless passengers Daniel had seen. And then, the video cut out. But it wasn't the video itself that terrified Daniel. It was the reflection in the windows of the train car. As the camera panned, there was a brief moment, a fraction of a second, where something appeared behind the man. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, standing at the far end of the car. It was watching him. Daniel dropped the camera, his pulse racing. He glanced around, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes on him, even though the car appeared empty. Whatever that thing was, it was still here. And now it was watching him. Panic surged through him again, and he scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward the front of the train. He had to get out. He had to escape before it was too late. But no matter how fast he ran, the train seemed to stretch on endlessly, one car blending into the next. Each door he opened revealed more horrors, more bodies, more whispers, and the suffocating feeling of being hunted. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed through yet another door, only to be greeted by a sight that froze him in his tracks. The conductor's car. It was dark, the windows covered in grime, and the controls were covered in dust, as if they hadn't been touched in years. But sitting in the conductor's seat was a figure, a man, slumped over, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Daniel approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his ears. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the man's shoulder. The body jerked upright, and Daniel stumbled back with a cry. The conductor's head lolled to one side, his empty eyes staring through Daniel, as if he didn't even see him. Then, with a rasping breath, the conductor spoke, his voice like the rusted groan of the train itself. "You're too late," he whispered, his words barely audible. "The train, it never stops. It never lets go." Daniel's blood turned to ice. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. The conductor's words echoed in his head. "The train never lets go." Was that it? Was this train some kind of purgatory, a limbo for lost souls? Had he been trapped the moment he stepped on board? Suddenly, the lights in the car flickered violently, and the train shuddered as it lurched forward. Daniel lost his balance, crashing into the wall as the train began to move. The screech of metal on metal filled the air, drowning out the whispers, the groans, and even the sound of his own breathing. The train was moving, faster and faster, hurtling toward some unknown destination. Desperation clawed at him. He had to find a way off, but how? There were no exits, no windows he could break. The train was a prison, and it was taking him deeper into the unknown. In a final act of defiance, he ran to the front of the car and grabbed the controls, pulling levers, pressing buttons, anything to stop the cursed thing. But nothing worked. Then, in the reflection of the cracked window, he saw it, the figure from the video. It stood just behind him, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden in darkness. Daniel turned slowly, his heart pounding in his throat. The figure took a step forward, its presence filling the car with a cold that seeped into his bones. "Why me?" Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" The figure remained silent for a long moment, its face unreadable. Then, in a voice that echoed with the weight of centuries, it spoke. "You boarded the train. Now you belong to it." With that, the figure reached out, its cold hand closing around Daniel's wrist, and everything went black.